He didn't just disappear. He erased himself. One day we were planning a future, and the next, he was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, no final conversation. 3 years of love ended without a single sentence. And now, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, his name was sitting in my inbox like nothing had happened. I was reviewing resumes when I saw it, and my stomach dropped so hard I thought I might be sick. Ethan Morrison. The man who vanished from my life without a word. The man who left his key on the counter and took everything else with him, my trust, my sense of reality, my ability to believe people mean what they say. I opened the resume, hoping it was coincidence. It wasn't. Same degree. Same certifications. Same career path I'd once helped him map out late at night on our kitchen floor. He hadn't just applied anywhere. He'd applied to my company. My department. Reporting directly to me. As if the silence never happened. As if I hadn't spent months replaying our last conversations, wondering what I'd done wrong, wondering how someone could love you on Friday and vanish by Monday. His resume was immaculate. Polished. Professional. No trace of the man who ghosted me after 3 years. No acknowledgement of the life we'd shared. No mention of the damage he left behind. Just qualifications, confidence, and audacity. I realized then that this wasn't an accident. It wasn't desperation. It was intentional. He knew exactly where I worked. He knew I'd be the one reading it. And instead of calling, instead of apologizing, instead of owning what he'd done, he'd chosen this. A job application. A formal request for access. He didn't knock on my door. He walked straight into my career. And in that moment, staring at his name on my screen, I understood something chilling. The man who vanished without explanation had come back asking for control. I sat very still, staring at the screen. Trying to process what I was looking at. 3 years. 3 years since he'd vanished without explanation. Without warning. Without the decency of a breakup conversation. We'd been together since college. 5 years total. Moved in together after graduation. Talked about marriage. About buying a house. About the future we were building. Then one day, he'd come home quiet. Distant. Said he'd been offered a position in Seattle. An opportunity he couldn't pass up. I'd been supportive. Excited, even. Asked when we'd start looking at apartments there. He'd gone silent. Then said something I'd never forget. I think I need to do this alone. I'd asked what that meant. He'd said he needed space. Needed to figure things out. Needed to see what life looked like without us being attached at the hip. I'd suggested long distance. Said we could make it work. He'd shaken his head. Said it wasn't fair to either of us. That clean breaks were better. That he'd call once he was settled. That we'd talk. He'd left that weekend. Packed his things while I was at work. Left his key on the counter. And then nothing. No call. No text. No email. I'd reached out. Once. Twice. A dozen times. Left voicemails that went unreturned. Sent messages that showed as read but got no response. Eventually, I'd stopped. Accepted that he was gone. That whatever we did hadn't mattered enough for him to explain why. Now, 3 years later, he wanted to work for me. The audacity of it settled in my chest like ice. I opened his cover letter. Read it carefully. It was professional. Well written. Highlighted his qualifications. Expressed enthusiasm for the role and the company. Mentioned that he'd followed our work for years and believed his skills would be a strong fit. Not a single word acknowledging that we knew each other. Not a hint that we had history. Just a clean, professional application. As if I were a stranger. I checked his LinkedIn profile. Updated recently. His current position was ending. The startup had been acquired. His role was being eliminated. He was looking for his next opportunity. And somehow, of all the companies he could have applied to, he'd chosen mine. I didn't believe in coincidences. Not like this. He knew I worked here. Knew what I did. Knew I'd be reviewing applications for this exact position. Because 3 years ago, we talked about my career trajectory. About where I wanted to be in 5 years. About the leadership role I was working toward. This wasn't an accident. This was calculated. And I needed to understand why. But first, I needed to decide what to do with the application sitting in front of me. Let me tell you who we were. My name is Kara Mitchell. I'm 31 years old. I work as a senior operations manager at a mid-sized tech company. I've been here for 4 years. Worked my way up from analyst to team lead to manager. I'm good at my job. Organized. Strategic. The kind of person people trust to handle complex problems without drama. Ethan Morrison was my college boyfriend, then my partner, then the person who disappeared from my life without explanation. We'd met sophomore year. Same major. Same study groups. Same ambitions. We'd been inseparable by junior year. Moved in together after graduation. Built a life that felt permanent. Stable. Real. He'd been smart. Ambitious. Charming. The kind of person who could talk to anyone and make them feel seen. I'd loved that about him. Loved how he made complicated things feel simple. How he pushed me to take risks I'd been too cautious to take alone. We'd been good together. Until we weren't. Until he decided we were holding each other back. Until he left. I'd spent months analyzing what went wrong. Replaying conversations. Looking for signs I'd missed. Wondering if I'd been too focused on my career. Too independent. Too something. Eventually, I'd stopped. Moved on. Dated other people. Built a life that didn't include him. And now he was back. Not in my personal life. In my professional one. And I had no idea what that meant or what I was supposed to do about it. I didn't make the decision immediately. I forwarded his application to HR. Asked them to review his qualifications independently. Told them I had a potential conflict of interest but didn't elaborate. They came back within 2 days. Said his resume was strong. That he met all the technical requirements. That he should move forward to the interview stage. I asked who would conduct the first interview. They said I would. Standard practice for my department. I could delegate if there was a conflict, but they'd need to know why. I sat with that for a full day. Trying to decide if I wanted to see him. If I wanted to give him the opportunity to explain. Or if I wanted to reject the application and never know why he'd applied. Eventually, I made a decision. Not an emotional one. A strategic one. I would interview him. Not because I wanted closure. But because I wanted to watch him try to explain this. I wanted to see if he'd acknowledge our history or pretend it didn't exist. I wanted to understand what he thought would happen when he walked into that room and saw me sitting across from him. I scheduled the interview for the following week. Sent the calendar invite through the automated system. Didn't add any personal note. Just the standard template. Date. Time. Location. Interview format. And then I waited to see if he'd show up. The week passed slowly. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. Not my team. Not my friends. Not the HR partner who'd flagged his strong qualifications. I just kept working. Kept managing my department. Kept reviewing other applications and conducting other interviews. But in the back of my mind, constantly, was the question. What would Ethan do when he walked into that conference room and saw me? Would he be surprised? Would he pretend he hadn't known? Would he acknowledge what he'd done 3 years ago? Or would he act like we were strangers meeting for the first time? I pulled his application again. Read it more carefully. Looked for clues. His work history showed steady progression. Strong roles. Good companies. He'd done well in Seattle. Built the career he'd left me to build. His references would probably be glowing. His skills aligned perfectly with what we needed. On paper, he was an ideal candidate. Which made this harder. Because if I rejected him based on our history, I'd be letting personal feelings interfere with professional judgment. But if I hired him, I'd be working directly with someone who'd abandoned me without explanation. Someone I'd loved. Someone who'd hurt me in ways I'd spent years recovering from. There was no clean answer. No obvious right choice. Just a decision I'd have to make and live with. The interview was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Thursday. I arrived at the conference room early. Set up my notes. Pulled up his resume on my laptop. Steadied my breathing. At 1:58, there was a knock on the door. I said, "Come in." And Ethan walked through. He saw me. And for 1 second, maybe 2, his expression cracked. Surprise. Then something else. Recognition. Regret. Maybe fear. But he recovered quickly. Smoothed his face into professional neutrality. Extended his hand. "Kara," he said. "It's good to see you." Not hi. Not "I didn't know you worked here." Not "I'm sorry for disappearing 3 years ago." Just "it's good to see you." Like we were old colleagues. Acquaintances. People who'd lost touch naturally. I shook his hand. Gestured to the chair across from me. Kept my voice level. "Please sit." He did. Adjusted his jacket. Set his portfolio on the table. Looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I opened his resume. Let the silence sit for a moment. Then I asked the first question. "Walk me through your decision to apply for this position." His eyes flickered. Just slightly. Because the question wasn't about his qualifications. It was about intent. And he knew it. Ethan cleared his throat. Launched into a prepared answer about how he'd been following the company's growth. How the role aligned with his skill set. How he was looking for his next challenge. Standard interview language. Professional. Impersonal. I listened without interrupting. Took notes. Let him finish. Then I asked the follow-up. "Were you aware I worked here when you applied?" Another flicker. Longer this time. He hesitated. Then said yes. He'd known. I asked why that hadn't been mentioned in his cover letter. He said he didn't think it was relevant to his qualifications. I asked if he thought it was relevant to the working relationship. He went quiet. Then said he understood it might be complicated. That he hoped we could keep things professional. I set my pen down. Looked at him directly. "You disappeared 3 years ago without explanation. No call. No message. No conversation. And now you want to work in my department. Reporting to me. You don't think that requires more than hoping we can keep things professional?" His composure slipped. Just for a moment. Then he said something that changed the entire dynamic. "I know I owe you an explanation. I should have given you one 3 years ago. If you hire me, I'll give you one now. Not an apology. An offer. Conditional. Transactional. You give me the job, I'll give you the truth. I stared at him. And in that moment, I understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about the job. This was about access. He wanted something. And he thought working for me was the way to get it. I ended the interview 10 minutes later. Told him we'd be in touch. Walked him to the elevator. Watched the doors close. Then I went back to my office and sat very still. Processing. He'd known I worked here. Had applied anyway. Had walked into that room knowing I'd be the one interviewing him. And he'd offered an explanation. Not freely. Not as an apology. As leverage. As something he'd trade for the job. That told me everything I needed to know about why he'd left 3 years ago. And why he was back now. I pulled his resume again. This time, I read between the lines. His current company had been acquired 6 months ago. His role was being eliminated in 2 months. He'd been job searching. And of all the positions available, he'd chosen this one. At my company. In my department. I checked the job posting. Looked at when it had gone live. 3 weeks ago. I checked his application timestamp. He'd applied the same day it posted. He'd been watching. Waiting. And the moment the opportunity appeared, he'd moved. This wasn't coincidence. This was strategy. I opened LinkedIn. Searched his connections. Scrolled through mutual contacts. And found what I'd been looking for. A former colleague of mine worked at his current company. I messaged her. Asked if she knew Ethan. She responded within an hour. And what she told me made everything click into place. My former colleague, Jessica, had worked with Ethan for 6 months before leaving his company last year. I asked her what she thought of him professionally. She said he was competent. Smart. But she'd gotten a strange vibe. I asked what she meant. She said he'd asked about me. Multiple times. How I was doing. What I was working on. Whether I was seeing anyone. She'd thought it was odd but hadn't mentioned it. She'd assumed we were old friends. I asked when these conversations had happened. She said throughout her time there. Even recently, after she'd left. He'd reached out to ask if she knew of any openings at my company. She told him about the position. Told him I'd probably be hiring for it. I thanked her. Ended the conversation. And sat with the information. Ethan hadn't stumbled upon this job posting. He'd sought it out. Cultivated a connection who could tell him when opportunities arose. Applied immediately. Walked into the interview knowing exactly what he was doing. He'd engineered this reunion. Not accidentally. Intentionally. And I needed to understand why. But more than that, I needed to decide whether to give him what he wanted. Whether to hire him. Or whether to shut this down completely. I didn't make the decision alone. I scheduled a meeting with my director. Explained that I had a conflict of interest with one of the candidates. That we had personal history. That I wasn't sure I could evaluate him objectively. My director asked if the history would interfere with managing him if he were hired. I said honestly, I didn't know. That the situation was complicated. That he'd ended our relationship abruptly 3 years ago and we hadn't spoken since. My director was quiet for a moment. Then asked if I thought he was qualified for the role. I said yes. On paper, he was one of the strongest candidates. But his motivations for applying were unclear. And that made me uncomfortable. She asked what I wanted to do. I said I wanted to bring him in for a second interview. With someone else present. Someone who could evaluate him purely on professional merit. And I wanted to ask him directly why he'd applied. Not about his qualifications. About his intent. She agreed. Said she'd sit in on the second interview. That we'd make the decision together. That personal history shouldn't disqualify a strong candidate, but it also shouldn't cloud our judgment. I scheduled the follow-up interview. This time, I sent the invitation myself. With a note. Second interview scheduled. My director will be present. Please be prepared to discuss your specific interest in this position and this company. I didn't have to spell it out. He'd know what I was asking. The second interview was different. More formal. My director, Sandra, took the lead. Asked technical questions. Pressed on his work history. Evaluated his problem-solving approach. Ethan performed well. Answered clearly. Demonstrated competence. Then Sandra asked the question I'd wanted to ask but couldn't without seeming personal. You've had a successful career in Seattle. Strong roles. Good trajectory. Why leave now? And specifically, why this company? Ethan glanced at me. Then back at Sandra. He said the acquisition had changed the culture. That he was looking for a company with growth potential and strong leadership. That he'd researched our organization and believed it aligned with his values. Sandra nodded. Then asked the harder question. Did your prior relationship with Kara influence your decision to apply? I kept my face neutral. Watched him. He didn't flinch this time. He said yes. It had. That he knew I worked here. That he knew it might be complicated. But that he also knew I ran a strong team and he wanted to work with someone he respected. Sandra asked if he thought he could maintain professional boundaries. He said yes. That what had happened between us was in the past. That he was focused on the future. Sandra looked at me. Asked if I had any questions. I had one. Why didn't you call 3 years ago? The room went silent. Sandra looked between us. Ethan stared at me. And for the first time since he'd walked in, his professional mask dropped completely. He said he'd been a coward. That he'd panicked when he got the job offer. That he'd convinced himself moving alone was the right choice but had been too ashamed to explain why. That he told himself he'd call once he got settled. That weeks became months became years. That eventually, it felt too late. That he'd wanted to reach out but didn't know how. I asked why now. Why apply to work with me after all this time? He said because he'd realized something in Seattle. That he'd made the biggest mistake of his life when he left. That he'd spent 3 years trying to build something that mattered and realized the thing that mattered most was what he'd walked away from. That he didn't expect me to forgive him. Didn't expect anything personal. But that he wanted the chance to prove he'd changed. That he could be professional. That maybe, over time, I'd see he wasn't the person who'd left anymore. I stared at him. And I understood. This wasn't about the job. This was about proximity. Access. A second chance he hadn't earned. Packaged as a professional opportunity. Sandra ended the interview shortly after. Said we'd discuss internally and be in touch. Ethan left. And Sandra looked at me. That's a no, she said. Right? I didn't answer immediately. Because part of me wanted it to be yes. I went home that night and did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out the box I'd packed 3 years ago. The one with photos. Letters. Small things Ethan had left behind that I couldn't throw away but couldn't look at either. I went through it. Slowly. Carefully. Remembered who we'd been. What we'd built. What I'd lost when he left. And I realized something. I'd spent 3 years convincing myself I was over it. That I'd moved on. That his leaving didn't matter anymore. But sitting there, looking at evidence of what we'd been, I understood. I hadn't moved on. I just stopped thinking about it. And now he was back. Offering an explanation I'd wanted desperately 3 years ago but didn't know if I wanted anymore. Offering proximity wrapped in professionalism. Offering a second chance that came with strings and complications and the very real possibility that he'd leave again the moment something better came along. I thought about what it would be like to work with him. To see him every day. To manage him. To separate personal history from professional interaction. To wonder constantly if he was there for the job or for me. And I knew. I couldn't do it. Not because I didn't forgive him. But because I didn't trust him. And trust, I'd learned, was the foundation of everything. Personal and professional. I told Sandra the next morning. Said I couldn't work with him. That the personal history was too complicated. That even though he was qualified, I didn't believe his motivations were purely professional. That hiring him would create a dynamic I couldn't manage objectively. Sandra asked if I wanted her to make the decision instead. To remove me from the process entirely. I said no. That I needed to own this. That he'd applied to my department knowing our history. That the decision was mine to make. And I was choosing not to hire him. Sandra asked if I was sure. Reminded me he was a strong candidate. That we'd been searching for weeks. That passing on him meant continuing the search. I said I was sure. That the right candidate would come. That it just wasn't him. Sandra accepted my decision. Sent the rejection email that afternoon. Standard template. Your qualifications were strong, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates. We appreciate your interest and wish you the best in your job search. Professional. Impersonal. Final. I didn't expect a response. But I got one. Ethan emailed me directly. Not through the application system. To my work email. Subject line, I understand. Inside was a message that made me close my laptop and walk away. The email said he understood my decision. That he'd known it was a long shot. That he didn't blame me for protecting myself. But that he wanted me to know the truth. He'd left 3 years ago because he'd been terrified. Not of commitment. Of failing. He'd built his entire identity around being successful. Around being the person who had everything figured out. And when he'd gotten the Seattle offer, he'd realized he didn't have anything figured out. That he didn't know who he was separate from us. From the life we'd built. That he'd convinced himself leaving was about career growth when it was really about running from the fear that he wasn't enough on his own. He'd spent 3 years in Seattle proving to himself that he could be successful alone. And he had been. Professionally. But personally, he'd been empty. He'd dated. Built friendships. Created a life. But nothing had felt right. Because he'd walked away from the one thing that mattered. And he'd been too proud to admit it. The job application had been a Hail Mary. A way to get close enough to show me he'd changed. To prove he wasn't running anymore. That he was willing to face what he'd done. To accept whatever consequences came with it. He said he wasn't asking for anything. Not a relationship. Not friendship. Just the chance to exist in the same space and show me through actions, not words, that he'd grown. But he understood why I'd said no. And he respected it. The email ended with one line. I'm sorry I didn't say this 3 years ago. You deserved better. I didn't respond to the email. Didn't call. Didn't reach out. I just sat with it. Let the words settle. Let myself feel the anger and sadness and betrayal all over again. And then, slowly, I let it go. Not because his explanation fixed anything, but because holding on to it wasn't serving me anymore. He'd left because he was scared. Because he'd prioritized his fear over our relationship. Over me. And nothing he said now could change that. The apology was real. I believed that. But it was also 3 years too late. 3 years I'd spent building a life without him. Building a career. Building confidence. Becoming someone who didn't need his validation or explanation to feel whole. He'd wanted proximity. A second chance packaged as a professional opportunity. And I'd chosen to protect myself instead. To maintain the boundaries I'd built. To keep my professional life separate from the personal chaos he represented. That choice felt right. Not easy. Not painless. But right. 2 weeks later, we hired someone else for the position. A candidate with strong qualifications and no personal baggage. Someone I could manage without constantly wondering about their motivations. Someone who showed up for the job, not for access to me. The position was filled. The search was over. And Ethan was gone again. This time, by my choice. I heard later that Ethan had found another position. In a different city. A different company. A fresh start that didn't include me. Part of me felt relief. Another part felt something harder to name. Not regret. Not longing. Just the quiet acknowledgement that we'd been important to each other once. And that importance had ended. Not cleanly. Not fairly. But definitively. I thought about what would have happened if I'd hired him. If I'd given him the proximity he wanted. The access. The second chance. Maybe he would have proven himself. Maybe he would have shown me he'd changed. Or maybe he would have realized, again, that the idea of us was better than the reality. That proximity wouldn't fix what he'd broken. That some things, once ended, can't be restarted. I'd never know. And I was okay with that. Because the decision hadn't been about him. It had been about me. About protecting the life I'd built. The career I'd earned. The boundaries I'd learned to maintain. He'd wanted to prove he'd changed. But I didn't need that proof. Didn't need his growth or his apology or his proximity. I just needed him to stay gone. And by saying no, by rejecting the application, I'd made sure he did. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if someone from your past has reappeared in your professional life, if you're being offered explanations you once desperately wanted but don't know if you want anymore, I want you to know something. You don't owe anyone a second chance. Not in your personal life. Not in your professional life. Not anywhere. People will tell you that forgiveness means letting them back in. That growth deserves recognition. That everyone makes mistakes. And maybe that's true. But forgiveness doesn't require proximity. Growth doesn't require your participation. And mistakes have consequences that don't disappear because someone finally apologizes. Ethan wanted access. Wanted to prove himself. Wanted a second chance he'd packaged as a job application. And I chose me instead. Chose my peace. Chose my boundaries. Chose the career I'd built without him. That choice was hard. It meant continuing a job search. It meant wondering occasionally if I'd been too harsh. It meant sitting with the discomfort of knowing he'd tried to come back and I'd said no. But it also meant protecting myself. Maintaining control over my own life. Refusing to let someone else's growth project become my burden. That protection mattered more than his apology. 3 years have passed since I rejected Ethan's application. I'm still at the same company. Still managing my department. Still building the career I'd planned long before he left and long after he tried to return. The position he applied for has been filled by someone excellent. Someone who's become a key part of my team. Someone whose presence doesn't carry the weight of abandoned promises and 3 years of silence. I don't think about Ethan often anymore. Not the way I did in the months after he left. Not even the way I did when his application appeared in my inbox. He's become background. A chapter that's closed. A lesson that's been learned. The lesson wasn't about him. It was about me. About knowing my worth. About protecting my boundaries. About recognizing when someone's growth shouldn't become my responsibility. He left because he was scared. He came back because he regretted it. And I said no because I'd built a life that didn't need him in it anymore. That progression, that growth, that clarity, was mine. Not his. Mine. And protecting it mattered more than giving him the chance to prove he'd changed. So here's what I want you to take from this. When someone from your past reappears, especially in a professional context, you don't owe them anything. Not an explanation. Not a second chance. Not the benefit of the doubt. What you owe yourself is clarity. About why they're back. About what they want. About whether letting them in serves you or just serves them. Ethan wanted proximity. Wanted to prove himself. Wanted to turn professional access into personal redemption. And I could have given him that. Could have hired him. Could have watched him try to earn back what he'd thrown away. But I chose differently. I chose boundaries over curiosity. I chose protection over possibility. I chose me. That choice didn't make me bitter. It made me clear. Clear about what I needed. Clear about what I wouldn't compromise. Clear about the difference between forgiveness and allowing someone back into my life. You can forgive someone and still say no. You can understand why they left and still refuse to let them return. You can acknowledge their growth without making it your responsibility to witness. That clarity, that power to choose yourself, is something no one else can give you. And no one else can take it away unless you let them. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever had someone from your past try to re-enter your life through your work, if you've struggled with whether to give someone a second chance they didn't earn, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what you chose and why. Because these stories matter. Not just as warnings, but as reminders that you have power. That saying no is valid. That protecting yourself isn't cruel. It's necessary. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories about boundaries. About second chances that weren't given. About choosing yourself when someone else's growth project comes knocking. Because the world is full of people who'll ask for access they haven't earned. Who'll show up years later with apologies and explanations and requests for proximity. And you'll have to decide whether to let them in. I chose no. I chose my career, my peace, my boundaries. I chose the life I'd built without him. And I've never regretted it. He ghosted me after 3 years. Then applied to work with me. And I reminded him that some doors, once closed, stay closed. Not out of bitterness. Out of self-respect. And that self-respect, that clarity, that boundary, was worth more than any explanation he could have given.